Many games in the Final Fantasy franchise feature multi-layered combat systems that grant the player plenty of choice about what actions they may choose to take. Alongside delivering standard physical attacks, it means players are often faced with choosing between expending a limited resource in the form of either a specific item or using MP to cast a spell, or using an ability or technique. Due to these abilities or techniques often not requiring the use of MP, their application is often made quite situational, as they need to be able to balance against the other forms of action. It means that sometimes these abilities end up being incredibly powerful when used in the right scenario, but others can end up being not all that useful. This, of course, includes abilities that simply don't work, but it can also include those that end up disadvantaging the player, to the point that these abilities end up being almost completely useless. So, with the caveat that we're only going to feature one ability per game, in this video we're going to cover 7 abilities that were seldom used due to a lack of utility, and we're going to start things off with a classic, Thunder Slash from Final Fantasy IX. Over the years, Thunder Slash has become a notorious sword art skill. The ability could be used by either Steiner or Beatrix, but the word used should be taken lightly, as due to a glitch, the base accuracy of Thunder Slash was set to 0. Due to the way that Final Fantasy IX's combat system worked, having a base accuracy of 0 did not mean that the ability would never be able to hit the target. Instead, it just meant it was an extremely unlikely outcome. Hit rate would increase as the character's magic stat and level increased, but due to the base accuracy being so low due to the aforementioned glitch, it meant the only time Thunder Slash had a somewhat reasonable chance of hitting an enemy was when the player was so much more powerful than the enemy that they didn't really need to use Thunder Slash in the first place. The uselessness of the ability was then underscored when squaring off against Beatrix. She would be able to use Thunder Slash as part of her arsenal, but this time it had a normal hit rate, and it was able to deal considerable damage to its intended target. Perhaps the most curious aspect around the glitch, though, isn't so much the glitch itself. Instead, it relates to why, despite there now being so many different iterations of Final Fantasy IX with so many different patches, Square Enix has never sought to fix this glitch. In the original version of Final Fantasy VIII, the Encounter Half and Encounter None abilities were quite important for numerous reasons. After learning both support abilities from Diablos at a cost of 30 AP and then 100 AP, they could be used to help avoid random encounters. Not only was this useful due to certain segments of play, such as when attempting to obtain Odin, but it would also be beneficial when running around the islands closest to Heaven and Hell, as it meant the potent draw points could be used without the risk of running into an unfriendly Marlborough. There were also numerous applications for those who wanted to undertake low-level runs or speed runs, something that Final Fantasy VIII was purpose-built for thanks to the junction system. But while this was all well and good, the ability was rendered completely obsolete when Square Enix released Final Fantasy VIII Remastered Edition. Even though both abilities were still present in the game, the remastered edition of Final Fantasy VIII came with numerous bells and whistles to help modernize the game, and one of them was the ability to simply turn off encounters at any point via the main menu. This meant that not only could players simply spend the 130 AP on other abilities, but they could also use the free support ability slots for something that made them much more battle ready. Final Fantasy VI featured quite a wide array of abilities, and while some of them were accessible when equipping specific accessories, others were innate to a specific character. One of the more intriguing special abilities in this regard was Sketch, which was associated with Relm, and it allowed her to paint a portrait of an opposing foe and then use one of their own abilities against them. This was quite a neat application, but to make proper use of Sketch, players would need to do some research. And this was because of how the accuracy of Sketch was calculated. For Relm to achieve a successful Sketch, her character level multiplied by 256, then divided by the target level, had to be greater than a random number between 0 and 255. Due to the random factor here, the equation boils down to Relm's level divided by the target's level as the probability that Sketch would work. For example, if Relm was level 50 and the target was level 50, it would always work. But if Relm was level 30 and the target was level 45, then there would be a 66.67% chance of Sketch working. This all seems quite reasonable, but the challenge related to what happened should Sketch be successful. If the sketch landed on an enemy that used elemental spells or status effects, then the abilities that could be used were quite redundant, as the enemy was often immune to that same element or status effect. The other side then related to damage dealing moves, as in this scenario, the ability Realm used would have its damage calculated based on the enemy's stats, not Realm's, and they were almost always lower. It meant that although there were fringe applications for Sketch, such as when squaring off against Ultros, it was nowhere near as good as many of the game's other special abilities. But even though Sketch itself was not all that useful the majority of the time, that did not make Realm a useless character. Far from it, as she had the highest starting magic power and some great equipment options. Final Fantasy XIV may seem like an uncommon entry onto this list, because due to its status as an MMO, there have been countless balancing patches introduced over time as a way of addressing issues. Having said that, because of the sheer volume of classes and associated abilities, some have slipped through the cracks, and that brings us on to the Astrologian. Since being introduced via Heavensward, Astrologians have been able to draw cards from their deck, which allows them to use the Arcanum that they draw. Previous versions of the card system included a handful of cards that players sometimes would not want to have drawn in certain circumstances. Whenever this happened, the player could then use the Undraw ability to put whichever card they just drew back into their deck. They would still have to wait for the cooldown on the draw ability before they could use it again, but they would at least be spared from drawing a card they did not want. In more recent times, the Astrologian deck was rebalanced to ensure there was no real downside from drawing a card even if you didn't want it, and they did this by making sure that every card had some use. That means it's now simply better to draw a card even if it may not be optimum than undraw it. This means that even if the effect isn't very powerful, it still results in a net positive if used. But despite this change, the undraw ability is still in the game, even though it has no practical application anymore. Final Fantasy X deviated away from typical character level convention by introducing the Sphere Grid. This system provided players with a lot more freedom to choose how they wanted their characters to develop, and although it initially pushed characters towards specific roles, by the end of the game, any character could learn any ability. That being said, some abilities were simply not worth learning, and one of the more specific examples here has to be Pray. Pray was an ability that healed the entire party for a small amount of HP without any cost. But due to its lack of scaling, the amount of HP it restored became more and more insignificant as the game progressed. In the end, it restored such a little amount of HP relative to the amount of damage that enemies dealt that using Pray was essentially a wasted turn that could have been spent on using something more impactful such as a healing item or casting a white magic spell. Due to the structure of the Sphere Grid, any character with access to Pray was also likely to have access to white magic, which was more potent. And this was almost always a better choice, especially in consideration with the large MP pools available to characters in that specific area. It was possible for a character to access Pray by using a special sphere, even if they weren't progressing through the White Mage section of the Sphere Grid, and therefore weren't likely to have access to white magic yet, but that special sphere would have been better used unlocking another ability elsewhere on the grid that had a bit more practical application. Final Fantasy XII featured a similar system to the Sphere Grid called the License Board. It too enabled every character to be developed with a high degree of freedom, granting access to specific equipment categories and abilities. In the original version of Final Fantasy XII, one of the earliest abilities that could be unlocked was First Aid. This was similar to Pray in Final Fantasy X in that it could restore a small amount of HP, but here it related to a specific target and had the caveat that they had to be in a critical state, otherwise it would miss. Within the first few character levels, when paired with the Gambit system, this actually had the potential to work quite well, as you could set the system to use First Aid if an ally's status was HP critical. However, once you either gained enough gil to purchase potions or better curative items, or gained access to a white mage, the effectiveness of First Aid was reduced. Partly this was due to how little HP was restored, but issues arose from that previous Gambit. After a while, First Aid would heal such a little amount of HP that party members who were assigned to use it at a certain HP threshold, like HP critical status, would often become stuck in a loop where it wouldn't heal enough to get them out of the critical status, or would heal them so little that they'd enter back in after a very short period of time. This loop could functionally take a party member out of combat for a while because they would be stuck repeating using first aid, and it highlighted the potential for wasted time and wasted actions. Due to the propensity for this ability to also fail should the recipient not be in a critical state, it was therefore much more effective to simply use a healing item or spell instead, and it meant that unless you were doing some kind of extreme run that prohibited using shops, first aid became quite redundant very quickly. That then brings us on to our last entry, which relates to Final Fantasy Tactics. One of the great things about Tactics was how expansive and expressive the job system was designed to be. Each class had numerous abilities that could be learned using job points, and there was plenty of utility across the board. However, some classes had abilities that ended up being a bit superfluous, and perhaps the best example was Aim plus 20, which was an ability associated with the Archer job. Learnt for 1,200 job points, Aim plus 20 forced the Archer to stay still for 20 turns to charge up a single attack, with the idea being that the attack would then deal a huge amount of damage. This came with numerous challenges though, the first being that there was no guarantee the attack would even land, which meant you could have a character immobilized on your team for 20 turns and have them deliver nothing at the end of the wait. There's also the chance that in those 20 turns, the target could have just been defeated by conventional means anyway. The only positive was that players could cancel the action, allowing the Archer to adapt to the changing state of the combat encounter. But that would then negate all the turns they'd already spent charging. In summary, unless the target had a huge amount of HP and could also be immobilized to ensure the attack actually landed at the end of the 20-turn wait, the applications for Aim plus 20 were fringe at best, and because of that, it was almost completely useless. It just goes to show, however, that not all abilities are created the same, and it's why we were rather excited to share with you this list of 7 abilities that ended up being almost completely useless. Were there any other abilities though that you think we've missed? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it and subscribe to the channel for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.